Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you and welcome to the latest in our series of Doha Debates, coming to you from the Gulf state of Qatar and sponsored by the Qatar Foundation. Political Islam has been back in the spotlight with Hamas battling Israel in the Gaza Strip. But where does that leave the scores of other Islamic political movements, many integrated in countries around the world? Some will argue that the vast majority have renounced violence and are therefore no threat to anyone. Others claim that whenever Islam is politicized, it should be treated as a serious danger. Whatever the case, is the international community now more frightened of Islam than it should be? It's with those questions in mind that we look beyond the latest conflict and offer you tonight's motion. This House believes that political Islam is a threat to the West. Well, on our panel, 4 Muslims with very different views of the subject. Speaking for the motion, Maajid Nawaz, a former leader of the UK branch of the Islamist party Hizb ut-Tahrir. The group is now banned in Britain and Mr. Nawaz was imprisoned in Egypt for 4 years. He's now director of the Quilliam Foundation, which seeks to counter extremism, and he also acts as advisor to the British government. With him, Yahya Pallavicini, an Italian Imam at the Al-Wahid Mosque in Milan and vice president of the Islamic religious community in Italy. Since 2000, he served on the board of the Islamic Cultural Center and taken part in numerous interfaith and educational initiatives. Well, against the motion, Shadi Hamid, an academic who's director of research at the Project on Middle East Democracy and Hewlett Fellow at the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. His research has focused on Islamic political groups and their participation in the democratic process. And with him, Sarah Joseph, editor of the Muslim lifestyle magazine, Emel, and a prominent advocate of interfaith dialogue and women's rights. Since becoming a Muslim 20 years ago, she's lectured widely on Islam and served as a member of the British Home Office Task Force on Extremism. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. And now let me call first on Maajid Nawaz to speak for the motion.
Thank you, Tim. Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you with the greetings of Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I begin in the name of Allah, the Compassionate and the Merciful. I want to emphasize at the beginning of this debate that this debate is not about whether Islam is a threat to the West. Islam is not a threat to the West. I'm a Muslim. Imam Yahya Pallavicini is a religious scholar. We are not here to convince you that Islam is a threat to the West. I've memorized half of the Quran. I love Islam. And here is a man who dedicates his life to preaching Islam. I also want to assure you that we do not think that politics is a threat to any country. Of course, we must engage in politics. Thirdly, I wish to assure you that we do not think that Muslims engaging in politics are a threat to the West or indeed to any country in the world. Muslims must engage in politics. And that's part of my job. I advise the British government. The point here that I wish to make to you today is that to politicize Islam, or indeed to politicize any religion, that is what is a threat to the West. It's when people wish to politicize the religion, and that is what's going on today. People are politicizing Islam, and therefore they engage in politics with a predefined ideological agenda, and it's not a religious agenda. Therefore, to politicize Islam and to engage in politics with a fixed agenda, using and utilizing religious scripture to justify one's political stand, that is what I wish for you to vote against here today. And I want to assure you that I have a personal history in the movements that try to politicize Islam and use it for their own agenda. I spent 13 years inside Hizb ut-Tahrir. I set up Hizb ut-Tahrir in Pakistan and in Denmark. And just as I'm very sorry, Tim, just as a correction, Hizb ut-Tahrir is not banned in the UK. And I was the one who tried to push the British government not to ban them, because we believe in engaging in debate and in dialogue, not in banning. I spent my time inside this organization and eventually was imprisoned in Egypt. I have personally seen how this is a danger to the West, because whilst I was in Newnham College, my own propagandizing of political Islam or Islamism led to a murder on campus, because we divided the students on the campus of Newnham College along sectarian and religious lines. So they dehumanized the other. They saw the other as somebody that was not from them. And very sadly, that situation eventually led to a murder. I have now left political Islam behind me and dedicate myself to critiquing this modernist, irreligious ideology known as Islamism. Thank you very much.
Maajid Nawaz, thank you very much indeed. You say that politicizing Islam is a threat. But what form does this threat take, and how serious is it?
Well, as I said, from my personal experience, what happens is that people divide human beings along sectarian lines when engaging in politics. So they see
but that's an attitude of mind, and that's the way they want to consider human beings. But where is the concrete threat from this?
So what happens as a result of that is that people see themselves as part of a collective, and the other collective is seen as the other. And that begins a dehumanizing process. And if we look at what's happening in the world today...
But that dehumanizes them.
It dehumanizes the other side as well as everyone who opposes what they believe in. But if
that's the way they want to consider people, what's the threat? Which
is why we don't call for banning them. But the threat is that in reality, Islamism has led to jihadism in the world. Every single terrorist jihadist organization emerged from an Islamist
organization. There's no jihadism in Britain, for instance, is there?
Of course there is. The former leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir, Umar Bakri Muhammad, set up Al-Mahajirun. Al-Mahajirun is an organization that has now been banned in the UK. He sits in Lebanon, in Tripoli, and still preaches hatred into the UK. 7/7 and other atrocities have been committed by people that began their ideological careers in Islamist organizations that were not violent.
But so simply preaching is the threat that you're worried about?
I'm very much worried about preaching hatred. And I think we all should be worried about preaching hatred. When we define ourselves as Muslims and everyone else as kuffar, when we define ourselves as heaven-bound...
They're preaching hatred, but who's listening?
Sorry?
I mean, you were 13 years in Hizb ut-Tahrir.
That's right.
What kind of threat were you to the British way of life?
There was a murder on Newnham College, and I was expelled from Newnham College because of that murder. There was a real and perceived threat on the campus of Newnham College, and a poor Christian student was killed by somebody who appointed himself as our bodyguard on
And what
campus.
Are you saying, that because of because of the politicization of Islam, that's likely to continue?
Yes.
Murders are likely to continue and multiply?
Yes, sadly, that's the situation.
As far as you're concerned, that's the concrete threat.
Sadly, that's the situation, and all jihadist organizations have emerged from Islamist organizations.
Maajid Nawaz, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now let me ask, please, Shadi Hamid to speak against the motion.
Well, the groups that Maajid are talking about are simply not representative of political Islam. Hizb ut-Tahrir, Al-Qaeda, jihadist groups, this is not what we mean when we're talking about political Islam. These groups have tiny constituencies and no mainstream legitimacy. Let's look instead at the largest, most influential Islamist groups in the Middle East. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan, the PJD in Morocco, the AK Party in Turkey, the ICM in Kuwait. All of these groups have fulfilled two very important conditions. They've renounced violence and they've committed themselves to the democratic process. Not only that, the vast majority of Islamist groups in the region have accepted many of the foundational aspects of democracy: alternation of power, popular sovereignty, and protection of minority rights. Also, Islamists are increasingly interested in reaching out to Western audiences and even Western government officials. The former Secretary General of the PJD in Morocco, Sa'ad-Din Othmani, came to Washington for a tour in May 2006. Who invited him? Who sponsored his visit? The US State Department. Two of America's closest allies in the region, Turkey and Iraq, who are they led by? Democratically elected Islamist parties. If Islamists are such a threat to the West, why are they so intent on cooperating with the West? Even on an issue as contentious as Israel, in my interviews with Muslim Brotherhood leaders in Egypt and Jordan, some of them are even willing now to say that they're willing to accept Israel's existence as part of a two-state solution. Assam al-Ariyan and Ibrahim al-Hudaybi, two prominent members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, even went so far as to write op-eds in the major Jewish American newspaper in the US, The Forward. So, I mean, that's a pretty big deal in my view. In short, on the key indicators that the West cares about, that Western policymakers care about, Islamists have moderated significantly. That's the point I'm trying to convey. I'm not here to defend political Islam. They are not liberals. They're very socially conservative. And when I sit down with Brotherhood leaders, oftentimes they'll say things that make me feel very uncomfortable. But this debate is not about whether American liberals like me or British liberals like Maajid feel comfortable with Islamism. This debate is about whether Islamists are a threat to the West, and clearly they are not.